My name is Lily and I'm 30 years old. But for so much of my life I felt ageless, trapped in a past that refused to loosen its grip. There are stories we carry within us, not as treasured memories, but as festering wounds hidden from the world, even from ourselves sometimes. Mine is one of those stories, a narrative woven with threads of deceit and unspeakable pain. Something I kept locked away for years, buried beneath layers of forced smiles and feigned normalcy. Because some truths are too heavy to bear, too grotesque to acknowledge, even to your own reflection in the mirror. You see, life has a cruel way of blindsiding you. It throws curveballs you never saw coming, shattering the fragile glass of your expectations, leaving you picking up the jagged pieces of a reality you never envisioned. I never imagined my life would become a living torment, a constant battle against the shadows of a truth I still struggle to accept. This isn't a tale of grand romance or idyllic family life, the kind that fills storybooks and happy dreams. No, mine is a story of bitter trade-offs, of emotions buried so deep they threaten to poison my very soul. People like to romanticize marriage, to paint it as a sacred bond built on the unwavering foundation of love. But even as a child, I knew that wasn't the truth for my mother and my stepfather. From the moment he entered our lives, a discordant note struck within me, a subtle unease that gradually crescendoed into a terrifying symphony of dread. It wasn't love that brought him to our door. It was something far more insidious, and my mother, bless her innocent heart, was merely a convenient stepping stone. I was the real reason he married her. My mother, Yisa, was a woman carved from resilience. After my father's passing when I was just a child, she became the unwavering anchor of our lives. She ran a small fashion shop, pouring her heart and soul into its success. It was more than just a business. It was her testament to survival, her defiant stand against the cruel hand fate had dealt us. With grit and determination that still amazes me, she nurtured not only me but also her little shop, transforming it into a beloved haven for style and local artistry. She was my rock, my guiding star, a beacon of strength and independence in a world that often felt cold and unforgiving. Life for a long while settled into a predictable rhythm. My mother would immerse herself in the vibrant world of fabrics and designs at her shop, while I diligently pursued my studies, my head buried in textbooks, dreaming of futures yet unknown. Time flowed steadily, carrying me towards the precipice of adulthood. University. It felt like a liberation, a long-awaited escape from the comforting, yet sometimes stifling embrace of my mother's protection. Stepping onto campus was like stepping into a kaleidoscope of new experiences, a whirlwind of ideas and possibilities. And then amidst this vibrant chaos, I met Mr. Matthew. He wasn't just my philosophy lecturer. He became something more. From the very first lecture I was captivated. His voice, a rich baritone, resonated through the lecture hall, weaving intricate tapestries of thought and ideas. He didn't just teach philosophy. He breathed life into it, making ancient wisdom relevant and profoundly personal. He opened my eyes to perspectives I'd never considered, challenged my assumptions, and ignited a spark of intellectual curiosity within me that had long been dormant. Our after-class conversations started casually, innocent inquiries about the course material, but they quickly evolved. We discussed everything and nothing, delving into the labyrinthine corridors of philosophy, yes, but also into life, art, music, the quiet mysteries of human existence. He seemed to truly see me, to understand the nascent thoughts struggling to find their voice within me. I started to believe he was a mentor, a guide, someone whose influence was shaping me in profound ways. But then a shift, subtle at first, almost imperceptible, like a change in the air before a storm. I began to notice something strange in his eyes when he looked at me. Initially, I dismissed it as my overactive imagination, the heightened sensitivity of a young woman navigating a new and exciting phase of life. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger, more insistent with each passing day. It was there in the lecture hall, across the crowded classroom, and more intensely, during those after-class discussions that had become so precious to me. There were moments when I was speaking, animated about some philosophical concept or personal reflection, that his gaze would linger, not with the detached observation of a teacher assessing a student, but with a deeper intensity. As if he was searching for something hidden within me, something beyond the words I was speaking. It was a gaze that held an intimacy I hadn't invited, a silence that throbbed with unspoken meaning. And it made me deeply, profoundly uncomfortable. Each time that look appeared, a ripple of confusion would spread through me. It wasn't the familiar, encouraging gaze of a mentor. It was examining, as if he was trying to decipher me, to anticipate something, some response, some offering I couldn't possibly understand. Was I imagining things? Was I projecting my own anxieties and insecurities onto his perfectly professional demeanor? The questions swirled in my mind, unanswered, unsettling. But the strangeness, that persistent feeling of unease, could not be denied. It was a low hum beneath the surface of our interactions, growing louder, more insistent, until it became impossible to ignore. It wasn't just his eyes anymore. As time went on, I started to notice other things, subtle shifts in his behavior, actions that on their own might seem innocuous, but collectively formed a disturbing pattern. Every time I spoke to him, or even just passed him in the hallway, he'd subtly maneuver to stand closer. A little too close. Sometimes he'd place a hand on my shoulder during a conversation, a gesture that might seem paternal or friendly in another context, but with him it felt heavy, possessive almost. It made my skin crawl. Those seemingly harmless gestures, that calculated proximity, they started to feel like weights, dragging me down into a sea of unease. Once he asked me to stay after class to discuss my essay. But the conversation that followed was nothing like our previous discussions. He barely touched upon my work. Instead, he steered the conversation into personal territory, asking questions that felt intrusive, probing into areas of my life that were none of his concern. He seemed to deliberately prolong the meeting, filling the silence with meaningless observations and forced pleasantries, creating an atmosphere thick with unspoken tension. That unnecessary gaze, that unwelcome intimacy, it suffocated me. I no longer felt the respectful distance, the professional boundary that should exist between a teacher and a student. The line had blurred and it was terrifying. Gradually, an instinct for self-preservation kicked in. I started avoiding him. The thought of seeing him, of enduring those unsettling looks and veiled gestures, filled me with a rising tide of anxiety. I invented elaborate excuses to avoid private conversations after class, feigning prior commitments, urgent appointments, anything to keep my distance. When he offered extra help with the course, I politely but firmly refused, claiming to be overwhelmed with other studies. But in my heart, the truth was far simpler. I just wanted to escape. I started sitting at the back of the lecture hall, as far away from him as possible, minimizing eye contact, becoming adept at diverting my gaze whenever he looked in my direction. Sometimes I'd even deliberately arrive late to class, hoping to slip in unnoticed and avoid any pre-lecture encounters. I convinced myself that if I simply avoided him, if I could just create enough physical and emotional space between us, everything would be all right. If I didn't have to face those strange looks, those unsettling actions, maybe, just maybe, I could banish the anxiety that was constantly churning within me. For the rest of the semester, I became a ghost, a shadow, meticulously avoiding any contact with Mr. Matthew. And strangely, it seemed to work. From my carefully constructed distance, everything appeared to return to normal. He resumed his role as a detached lecturer, his gaze seemingly directed at the blackboard or the general student body, never lingering on me. I started to breathe again, a fragile sense of relief washing over me. I was convinced that the trouble had passed, that my anxieties had been unfounded, a product of my own oversensitivity. The safety I had so painstakingly constructed, however, was an illusion, a temporary reprieve from a storm that was gathering strength, brewing just beneath the surface of my carefully crafted peace. I had no way of knowing that the real tempest was yet to come, that it would arrive not in the sterile halls of the university, but in the one place I had always considered my sanctuary, home. After a year at university, when the semester ended and I returned home for the break, I immediately noticed a change in my mother. A subtle, yet undeniable shift in her demeanor. She was lighter, more cheerful than I'd seen her in years. Her eyes, once etched with the quiet weariness of single parenthood, now sparkled with a newfound vitality. Whenever she spoke, her voice held a warmth, a resonance of genuine happiness. She'd often catch me watching her, a small secret smile playing on her lips, a soft, contented chuckle escaping her throat, as if she harbored a private joy she couldn't quite contain. I was curious, of course, wondering what had sparked this transformation. But when I asked, she'd simply brush it off, attributing it to the natural ebb and flow of life, claiming things were just getting better. Then one sunny afternoon, as we sat together in the living room, sunlight streaming through the windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, my mother turned to me, her face radiant. Her eyes, usually soft and gentle, were now shining with an unconcealed joy. She took a deep breath, a slight tremor of excitement in her voice, and announced that she had something important to share. She'd met someone special, she said, her voice hushed with tenderness. Someone she wanted me to meet. Seeing the pure, unadulterated happiness radiating from her, my heart swelled with the genuine joy of my own. For so many years, my mother had carried the weight of the world on her shoulders, raising me alone, sacrificing her own happiness, her own desires to ensure I had everything I needed. The thought that she might finally have found some joy, some companionship, a chance at a happiness she so richly deserved, filled me with a profound sense of relief and hope. The day my mother prepared to introduce me to this special man, a palpable sense of anticipation hung in the air. The house, usually comfortably lived in, was meticulously arranged, every surface gleaming, every cushion perfectly plumped. The dining table was set with her finest china, a delicate floral pattern that had always been reserved for special occasions. I could see the flutter of excitement in her movements, the barely contained joy in her eyes. I too found myself looking forward to meeting this man, this unknown entity who held the potential to bring lasting comfort and happiness into my mother's life, a life that had known too much solitude. When the doorbell rang, a sudden flutter of nerves danced in my stomach. This was it, the moment of introduction. My mother, with a lightness in her step I hadn't seen in years, hurried to the door, her smile widening with each step. I stood waiting in the living room, my imagination conjuring up images of the man who was about to enter our lives, a faceless benefactor of my mother's renewed happiness. Then the door swung open, and my world tilted on its axis. The man standing in the doorway, bathed in the afternoon sunlight, was Mr. Matthew. An indescribable shock ripped through me, leaving me breathless, paralyzed. I stood rooted to the spot, my mind refusing to process what my eyes were seeing. Mr. Matthew. Here. In our home. The man my mother loved. The man she was about to introduce to me with such radiant trust and overflowing happiness, was him. The very man I had spent months meticulously avoiding. The source of my persistent unease. The phantom lurking in the shadows of my university life. All the anxieties, all the premonitions I had felt about him, the subtle hints of something wrong, suddenly coalesced, rushing back, surrounding me, suffocating me. A maelstrom of conflicting thoughts exploded in my head. Why him? How? When did they even meet? Did he know? Did he have any ulterior motives, some hidden agenda I couldn't even begin to fathom? The unease in my heart, which I had desperately tried to suppress, now surged with terrifying force, a tidal wave threatening to drown me. The fragmented memories of his strange looks, his unsettling gestures, those unwanted moments of intimacy, flashed through my mind, no longer isolated incidents, but pieces of a horrifying puzzle, clicking into place with sickening clarity. It was impossible to think clearly, to make sense of this impossible reality. I looked at my mother, desperately searching for some flicker of recognition in her eyes, some sign that she, too, understood the profound strangeness of this situation. But her face was a mask of pure, innocent joy. She was utterly oblivious, still smiling radiantly, introducing Matthew with an unwavering happiness, as if everything was perfectly normal, perfectly right. In her innocent heart, this was simply the unveiling of the man she loved, the beginning of a new chapter in her life, completely unaware of the storm that Matthew's presence was unleashing within me. Mr. Matthew stepped into the living room, still smiling, utterly composed, radiating an air of calm friendliness and polite charm. He greeted me, his voice smooth and practiced, then feigned surprise, his eyebrows raised in mock astonishment, claiming he never expected me to be my mother's daughter. I forced a smile, a pathetic imitation of genuine surprise, but inside I was in utter turmoil. My mother, bless her naivete, completely bought into his performance, laughing at the unexpected coincidence of her philosophy lecturer becoming her future husband. The two of them launched into a cheerful conversation, excitedly discussing this unforeseen connection, oblivious to the silent scream trapped in my throat to the icy grip of insecurity that was tightening around my chest. I stood there, a silent observer in my own life, a feeling of profound insecurity clinging to me like a shroud. The question echoed endlessly in my mind. Who is Mr. Matthew really? And why had he appeared in my mother's life, in a role so drastically different from the one I knew, the one that had already filled me with so much disquiet? Was this really just a random coincidence, a bizarre twist of fate? Or was there something far more sinister hidden beneath the surface, something I couldn't see, couldn't yet grasp, but felt with every fiber of my being? From that day forward, life continued on the surface, as if nothing had changed. There were no overt signs of strangeness from Matthew, nothing tangible to justify the turmoil raging within me. Mom and Matthew grew closer, their relationship blossoming with a seemingly effortless ease. Their affection appeared genuine, their happiness contagious. I watched my mother, truly happier than I'd seen her in years, smiling more frequently, her face radiating a youthful glow I thought she'd lost forever. It wasn't long before my mother announced her decision to remarry. Matthew officially became my stepfather, cementing his place in our family, in our lives. The wedding was a small, intimate affair, filled with quiet joy and heartfelt promises. Everything unfolded smoothly, seamlessly. There were no dramatic pronouncements, no unsettling incidents, no red flags waving in the periphery. Our family life settled into a new rhythm, peaceful and stable, or so it appeared on the surface. As time passed and still no strange signs emerged, no whispers of the unease that had once haunted me, I began to question my own perceptions, to wonder if I had been wrong all along, if my initial worries had been nothing more than the exaggerated anxieties of a young woman grappling with the complexities of changing family dynamics. Seeing my mother's genuine happiness, witnessing the gentle affection between her and Matthew, I gradually began to relinquish my doubts and insecurities. The most important thing, I reasoned, was that my mother had found happiness, a love to share her life with. Finally, I managed to convince myself to accept their relationship, to genuinely offer them my blessing. From the bottom of my heart, I hoped that my mother would continue to live in this newfound joy, that her days would be filled with sunshine and laughter. And I tried with every ounce of my will to accept Matthew, not just as my stepfather, but as a true part of our family. As time continued to march forward, and the months bled into years, I saw no further cause for concern. Matthew remained the picture of a loving husband, a supportive stepfather. My worries, once so vivid and insistent, faded into distant echoes, replaced by a growing sense of self-reproach. I started to blame myself for thinking too much, for allowing unfounded anxieties to cloud my judgment. Seeing my mother increasingly radiant, more joyful than I could remember, I felt a profound sense of relief. I truly believed that my initial concerns had been nothing but my own oversensitivity, my overactive imagination running wild. I was happy for my mother, sincerely wishing her a future brimming with joy and unwavering happiness. At that point, I genuinely believed that everything would proceed peacefully, that the unease of the past was just a fleeting shadow, banished by the light of their evident happiness. It had been so long since I'd sensed anything remotely unusual from Matthew. Gradually, a sense of reassurance settled within me. I no longer harbored doubts, no longer questioned my stepfather's motives. He had consistently proven himself to be a kind and considerate man, a good husband to my mother, and a benign presence in my life. I wholeheartedly embraced the narrative that my previous anxieties had been mere figments of my youthful sensitivity, a product of an overactive imagination. When I turned 22, armed with a newly minted university degree, I ventured into the daunting world of job hunting. While the perfect career opportunity hadn't yet materialized, I decided to lend a hand to my mother at her fashion store. Working alongside her brought us even closer, deepening the bond we already shared. Matthew, too, became a more frequent presence at the store, often stopping by in his free time, offering help with small tasks, lending a hand with repairs, becoming a familiar and welcome fixture in our daily lives. Everything was still proceeding smoothly, peacefully. The last vestiges of my earlier unease had completely evaporated, replaced by a comfortable acceptance. I wholeheartedly believed that Matthew was a good man, a loving husband, a solid and dependable presence in our family. He had seamlessly woven himself into the fabric of our lives, becoming an integral part of our shared narrative. But then, on what would become indelibly etched in my memory as the worst day of my life, everything shattered. The fragile illusion of peace, the carefully constructed facade of normalcy, crumbled into dust, revealing the horrifying truth that had been lurking beneath the surface all along. I woke up that morning feeling utterly wretched. A fever had gripped me in its icy claws, leaving my body weak, leaden and aching. The thought of going to the store with my mother, as I usually did, was utterly unbearable. My mother, ever solicitous, insisted I stay home and rest. I didn't argue. The only thought in my fever-addled brain was to crawl back into bed and succumb to the blessed oblivion of sleep. Matthew, my stepfather, was home that day, as he didn't have classes to teach. Initially, the thought of being alone with him didn't trigger any alarm bells. After all these years of living under the same roof, sharing meals, celebrating holidays, I had genuinely come to believe in his goodness, his trustworthiness, his deep love for my mother. He was family, wasn't he? I retreated to my room, burrowing under the covers, desperately willing sleep to claim me, to silence the throbbing in my head, to quell the relentless ache in my bones. But peace remained elusive. Then the thing I never, in my wildest nightmares, imagined happening happened. In the very house I considered my sanctuary, the safest place on earth, Matthew came into my room. He entered softly, his footsteps barely audible on the carpet. He held a glass of water in one hand and a small white pill in the other. He said they were painkillers, something to help bring down my fever, his voice gentle, concerned. Nothing in his demeanor, in his words, in his eyes, betrayed any ulterior motive, nothing that sparked even a flicker of suspicion in my fever-fogged mind. My head was swimming, my thoughts sluggish and disjointed. I wasn't thinking clearly, wasn't processing information with my usual acuity. All I craved was relief, escape from the throbbing pain, a descent into the oblivion of sleep. So, I accepted the pills from him without hesitation. I took the glass of water, swallowed the pill, and obediently drank, utterly unaware that this seemingly innocuous act was merely the prelude to a nightmare of unimaginable horror. At that moment, everything still seemed normal. There was no immediate change, no alarming sensation. The medicine, whatever it was, didn't seem to take effect instantly. I remained fully conscious, my senses alert, albeit dulled by the fever. I lay there quietly waiting, hoping for the promised relief, expecting the fever to gradually subside, allowing me to drift into a restorative slumber. But then, after what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 20 minutes, things began to shift. Matthew returned to my room. This time he carried no glass of water, no comforting pills. But there was something in his eyes. A subtle flicker, a glint of something darker, that sent a prickle of unease crawling up my spine. I instinctively tried to sit up, to raise myself against the pillows, but a jolt of terror shot through me. My body wouldn't obey. It was as if I was encased in lead, heavy, immobile. A horrifying sensation of paralysis spread through me with alarming speed, starting in my limbs and rapidly engulfing my entire body, stealing my strength, rendering me utterly helpless. Panic flared hot and sharp in my chest. I fought against this sudden, inexplicable weakness, mentally screaming at my muscles to respond, to move, to escape this terrifying helplessness. But it was futile. There was nothing I could do but lie there, rigid, eyes wide with dawning horror, as Matthew walked closer. He approached the bed slowly, deliberately, his face calm, almost serene. But his eyes were no longer gentle or concerned. They now held a chilling intensity, a predatory glint that sent shivers of icy dread down my spine. I struggled again, desperately trying to move, to flinch away, but my body remained stubbornly, terrifyingly paralyzed. Not even a finger twitched. The utter helplessness, the complete lack of control over my own body, was paralyzing in itself, a wave of pure, unadulterated fear washing over me. But that fear intensified exponentially as Matthew leaned down, his face now just inches from mine. And then he smiled. But it wasn't the familiar, friendly smile I'd seen countless times over the years. This smile was different. Distorted. Something cold and deeply, disturbingly sinister lurked behind that carefully constructed facade of pleasantness. Then he whispered, his voice soft, almost a caress, but clear enough for me to hear each chilling word. "I have waited for this opportunity," he breathed, his voice laced with a chilling satisfaction. "For a very long time." Horror, raw and visceral, clawed at my throat, choking off any scream that might have formed. I was paralyzed not just physically but emotionally, mentally. Disbelief warred with a sickening, dawning comprehension. My mind reeled, frantically trying to make sense of the fragmented pieces of reality that were suddenly, violently colliding. But everything was dissolving, falling apart. The vague worries, the suppressed doubts from the past, suddenly solidified, becoming terrifyingly real. And in that moment of pure, unadulterated terror, I realized with bone-chilling certainty that the nightmare I had dismissed as mere imagination had become my horrifying, inescapable reality. Matthew settled onto the edge of the bed beside me, his eyes now alight with a disturbing calculation. That chilling smile still played on his lips, devoid of warmth, radiating a sinister triumph. I lay there, utterly helpless, trapped in my own body, unable to move, unable to resist, only able to listen, to absorb the horrifying truth that was about to be unveiled. He began to speak, his voice soft, almost conversational. Yet each sentence resonated with a chilling clarity, peeling back layers of carefully constructed deceit, revealing a monstrous truth I had never even conceived. He confessed, in a tone of unsettling detachment, that his interest in me had begun the moment I walked into his university classroom, fresh-faced, naive, full of youthful idealism. He claimed he had felt an immediate, overwhelming attraction, an obsession, that had consumed him from the start. He had desperately wanted to get closer to me, to possess me, to weave himself into the fabric of my life. He recounted his calculated attempts to initiate conversations, to foster a closer relationship, all carefully disguised as mentorship, as professional guidance. But he had noticed, he said, with a hint of bitterness in his voice, that I had always maintained a careful distance, that I had instinctively resisted his attempts to get close. My avoidance, my subtle rejections, he claimed, had fueled his determination. And that's when, he explained, he had devised another path, a more efficient way to become intimately entangled in my life. He had started to investigate me, to delve into my personal information, my family background, his access made easy by his position at the university. When he learned about my mother, about our family situation, a horrifying plan began to take shape in his mind. He had realized with chilling clarity that the only way to truly get close to me, to exert control over my life, was through her. He had meticulously planned his approach, his calculated courtship of my mother, his carefully crafted performance of the perfect suitor, the ideal partner. Everything, he revealed, had been a carefully orchestrated performance, a calculated manipulation, designed solely to bring him closer to me. He had courted my mother, charmed her, proposed marriage, all with the ultimate horrifying goal of becoming my stepfather, of insinuating himself into my family, of gaining access to me, of waiting for the opportune moment to possess me. Hearing his words, each syllable a venomous barb, I felt myself plummeting into a black abyss of despair. Disbelief, disgust, and a soul-crushing wave of betrayal washed over me. I couldn't fathom the sheer depth of his depravity, the meticulousness of his manipulation. Everything I had believed, everything I had accepted as normal, as my mother's happiness, now twisted into a grotesque parody of reality. Her joy, her radiant smile, our seemingly peaceful family life. It had all been a lie, a carefully constructed stage set for his twisted desires, a cruel charade with me as the unwitting ultimate target. The pain, the utter disgust was overwhelming, suffocating. To realize that from the very beginning, from the moment he entered our lives, it had all been a calculated, predatory game, with my mother merely an unwitting pawn, and me the ultimate prize, it was a horror beyond words. As his chilling confession concluded, Matthew began to move closer, his eyes now blazing with a terrifying satisfaction, a predatory gleam as he saw me lying motionless, utterly vulnerable, completely at his mercy. I was trapped, utterly helpless, as Matthew loomed over me. The eyes that my mother had seen as loving and kind, the eyes that had once feigned professional interest in me, were now stripped bare, revealing their true nature, greedy, cold, devoid of any humanity. I instinctively tried to shrink back, to burrow further into the pillows, to somehow disappear, but there was nowhere to escape, nowhere to hide. Every movement, every desperate attempt to resist, was utterly futile. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the suffocating silence of the room, but my body remained locked, unresponsive, no longer obeying my will. And then Matthew leaned down, his hand sliding over me, touching me with a sickening familiarity, a possessive claim that made my stomach churn with revulsion. He took control. He took my body. Without mercy. Without a shred of compassion. I could only lie there paralyzed, feeling every agonizing moment, each touch a violation, each second stretching into an eternity of horror. All I could do was endure, to pray for it to end, to somehow survive this unspeakable violation. But he didn't stop. He continued, relentless, methodical, as if I were an object, a possession, not a human being. The world around me seemed to implode, collapsing inward, crushing me beneath its weight. Everything I had known, everything I had cherished, every semblance of safety and security, was being ripped away from me, torn to shreds by this monstrous act. I wanted to scream, to fight back, to unleash the fury and revulsion that was building within me. But it was all in vain. My voice was trapped in my throat, my limbs remained unresponsive. My body no longer belonged to me. Time itself seemed to warp and distort, dragging on forever, each passing second a fresh wave of torment, a new layer of violation. I lay there, helpless, staring blankly at the ceiling, desperately trying to detach myself from reality, to escape into some imagined sanctuary. But there was no escape. The horror kept unfolding, slowly, agonizingly, relentlessly. The feeling of paralysis, of utter powerlessness, of losing all control, amplified the terror, the violation with each passing second. Each minute, each move he made, each touch, felt like a brutal assault on my very being. A systematic dismantling of my self-esteem, my dignity, my sense of self. Pieces of me shattered, splintering into fragments, with no way to stop the destruction, no way to salvage the wreckage. I felt my body become alien, detached from my mind, no longer me. I was utterly, irrevocably taken over by him. Everything happened in slow motion. Each agonizing detail burned into my memory. Each sensation seared onto my soul. I could only lie there, living in a waking nightmare, in a suffocating prison of terror, with no hope of rescue, no possibility of resistance. Each moment lasted an eternity, and all I desperately wished for was for it to finally, mercifully end. When it was finally over, the silence in the room descended like a shroud, heavy, suffocating, lifeless. I lay there feeling utterly empty, numb, hollowed out. The room itself seemed cold, sterile, devoid of life. Matthew stood up, adjusting his clothes, his movements casual, almost nonchalant, as if nothing of consequence had just occurred. While I remained still, broken, unable to escape the lingering horror of what I had just endured, the indelible stain of violation. I felt my entire world crumble into dust. Everything I knew, everything I believed in, had just been irrevocably shattered, reduced to meaningless fragments. My mind was a chaotic storm of echoing questions, a vortex of pain, anger, and disbelief. Why? Why me? Why us? How could this have happened? How could the man my mother loved, the man I had tried so hard to accept as part of our family, commit such an unspeakable act? The pain of the violation was intertwined with the crushing weight of betrayal, the soul-deep wound of trust shattered beyond repair. Fear, anger, disgust, and a profound, aching helplessness. They all collided within me, a toxic cocktail suffocating me, leaving me gasping for air, for sanity, for any semblance of hope. Matthew glanced at me one last time, a fleeting, almost dismissive look. His eyes were cold, devoid of remorse, completely indifferent to the devastation he had wrought. Then he turned and left the room, disappearing down the hallway, leaving me alone in the wreckage of my shattered world, surrounded by the ghosts of horror, torment, and a burgeoning, all-consuming obsession for justice, for retribution. I didn't know how to face this new horrific reality. I didn't know how to take another breath, let alone how to continue living in a world that had suddenly turned monstrous, where everything I had once held dear had become tainted, poisoned, utterly meaningless. After what felt like hours, though it could have been only minutes, as the insidious effects of the paralyzing drug gradually began to wear off, a flicker of sensation, a faint whisper of control slowly returned to my body. Weak, trembling, dizzy, but no longer completely immobile, I managed to push myself up. Every movement was agonizing, every muscle screaming in protest, but a primal instinct for survival, a desperate need to escape this nightmare, propelled me forward. My hands shook uncontrollably as I fumbled with my clothes, desperately trying to straighten them, to somehow conceal the physical traces of the horror I had just endured, as if outward appearances could somehow erase the internal devastation. I looked around the room, my gaze landing on the phone on the bedside table. It was my only lifeline, my only hope of escape, my only means of summoning help, of bringing this living nightmare to an end. With unsteady steps, legs trembling, I approached the table, my hand shaking so violently I could barely grasp the receiver. I lifted it, my fingers fumbling with the buttons, each digit an agonizing effort. I dialed 911, each number a desperate plea for Joju. When the operator's voice, calm and professional, came through the line, a dam inside me broke. I took a deep, shuddering breath, desperately trying to control the tremors in my voice, and poured it all out. I told her everything. The words tumbled out, a torrent of fear, pain, and barely suppressed hysteria, painting a fragmented, horrifying picture of the unspeakable violation I had just suffered. The police arrived with astonishing speed, though to my distorted perception of time, it felt like an eternity had passed. The sudden intrusion of flashing lights, the urgent voices, the sound of hurried footsteps breaking the oppressive silence of the house, was almost surreal. When they entered the room, the sterile stillness shattered, replaced by a flurry of activity, by the sounds of authority, of impending justice. And finally they found Matthew. He didn't resist. He offered no excuses, no denials, no protestations of innocence. He simply bowed his head, silently defeated, as the officers placed handcuffs on his wrists. It was as if, deep down, he had known all along that this moment of reckoning would eventually arrive. My mother returned home shortly after Matthew's arrest. She arrived to a scene of chaotic confusion, police cars parked haphazardly in front of the house, uniformed officers milling about, the air thick with unspoken tension. She saw me, still trembling, visibly shaken, standing numbly beside a police officer. At first, confusion clouded her face. She didn't understand the scene unfolding before her eyes, couldn't decipher the silent drama playing out in our living room. She looked at me, her eyes searching, questioning. And in that moment, looking into her bewildered, trusting eyes, all the carefully constructed walls I had erected around my shattered emotions crumbled. My carefully maintained composure dissolved. All my strength seemed to evaporate. I couldn't hold it back any longer. Tears streamed down my face, hot, unrestrained, as I finally brokenly told her everything. My voice cracked, faltered, dissolved into sobs as I choked out the horrific truth about Matthew, about his calculated deception, about the unspeakable act he had committed, about the living hell I had just endured. My mother listened in stunned silence, her eyes widening with each horrifying detail, her face draining of color, contorting in disbelief and mounting pain. She didn't interrupt, didn't utter a word throughout my agonizing confession. She simply stood there, rigid, as if her entire world, the world she had so carefully built, the world she had so naively trusted, was collapsing around her, brick by agonizing brick. When my voice finally trailed off, when the story reached its devastating conclusion, my mother crumpled. She sank to the floor, a broken heap of grief and inconsolable regret, sobbing uncontrollably, her body racked with tremors of anguish. She blamed herself relentlessly, mercilessly, for her naivete, for her blindness, for not seeing the monster lurking beneath Matthew's charming facade, for bringing such a predator into our lives, into our home, into our family. Lost in her own abyss of pain, she could only repeat one sentence over and over again, a litany of self-recrimination. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. But even in her raw, agonizing grief, even in her heartfelt remorse, I knew with a cold certainty that no apology, no amount of self-blame, could ever erase the pain we were both feeling, could ever undo the irreparable damage that had been done. That day everything changed. Forever. My mother could never truly forgive herself. And I knew with a heavy heart that I could never truly go back to the person I was before, to the life I had once known. After the police led Matthew away, a part of me, a small fragile shard of my being, experienced a faint flicker of relief. Justice, in its most rudimentary form, had been served. He was arrested. He would be held accountable. But the relief was fleeting, ephemeral, quickly swallowed by the vast, gaping emptiness that remained. The arrest, the promise of legal repercussions, did nothing to alleviate the profound pain. the lingering horror that clung to me like a suffocating shroud. I had gained a measure of justice, yes. I had bravely faced the truth, spoken the unspeakable, taken the first step toward reclaiming some semblance of control over my life. But that didn't mean the haunting would simply vanish. The trauma, the violation, the betrayal, it was all still there, etched deep within my soul, a permanent scar marring the landscape of my inner world. My mother, overwhelmed by guilt and self-reproach after hearing the full, devastating truth, sank into a deep state of remorse and regret. She became consumed by her own perceived failures, unable to forgive herself for her blindness, for her misplaced trust. The weight of her unintentional complicity in this horrific tragedy crushed her spirit. She made the agonizing decision to leave the house, the home we had shared for so long, the place now tainted by unspeakable memories. She closed the fashion store, her beloved sanctuary, her life's work, seeking refuge in solitude, hoping to find some semblance of peace, some measure of solace, in the vast emptiness of her grief. Matthew was eventually convicted, his carefully constructed facade of respectability finally shattered, his monstrous actions exposed to the harsh light of justice. I knew I would never have to see him again, never have to face his chilling gaze, never have to endure his predatory presence in my life. But even that legal victory felt hollow, insufficient. It wasn't enough to erase the wounds he had inflicted, the damage he had wrought upon my life. He had stolen something precious, something irreplaceable. He had irrevocably altered the course of my existence, leaving me with a pain that time, I feared, would never fully heal, a scar that would forever mark my soul. From these horrific events, from the ashes of my shattered innocence, I gleaned some hard-won, bitter truths. I learned that silence is never the answer, that burying pain and fear only allows them to fester, to metastasize, to poison everything they touch. Courageously facing the truth, no matter how agonizing, no matter how deeply it wounds you, is the only path, however arduous, to find even a sliver of peace, to reclaim some semblance of your own life. Silence and concealment, I realized with chilling clarity, only prolong the agony, allowing the darkness to consume you from within. I also understood with profound regret that even though my mother had been completely unaware of Matthew's true nature, the unshakable trust she had placed in him, and perhaps in me, had inadvertently paved the way for this catastrophe, had led to consequences neither of us could have ever foreseen. The importance of open communication, of honestly sharing feelings, of expressing those nagging intuitions, those unsettling thoughts with loved ones, became searingly clear. If I had possessed the courage to speak up, to voice my unease, to articulate the subtle, yet persistent sense of wrongness I had felt around Matthew, perhaps, just perhaps, things might not have spiraled into such devastating depths. Perhaps if I had broken my silence sooner, this unimaginable horror could have been averted. Although Matthew was punished, held legally accountable for his monstrous actions, and my mother in her own way, had come to recognize her tragic mistake, our lives as we had once known them, would never return to normal. The idyllic past was irrevocably lost, swallowed by the darkness of Matthew's betrayal. I was left to navigate a new unfamiliar landscape, to learn to live with the constant ache of the pain, with the relentless hauntings of the past, to somehow painstakingly piece together the fragments of my shattered life, to find a fragile measure of peace amidst wounds that felt too deep, too raw, to ever fully heal. My mother, too, embarked on her own solitary journey of healing, grappling with the crushing weight of guilt, struggling to find a way to forgive herself for her unwitting role in this tragedy. Everything was still in flux, still uncertain. The future remained shrouded in mist, the path ahead unclear, daunting, fraught with unknown obstacles. But one thing, I knew with unwavering certainty, had irrevocably changed within me. I would not be silent anymore. I would no longer allow fear or shame to dictate my narrative. I would continue to move forward one faltering step at a time, no matter how arduous, how emotionally draining the road ahead might be. The regret, the pain, the memories of that horrific day, they would likely follow me, shadows clinging to my heels, for the rest of my life. But I knew deep in my heart that I had taken the first crucial step on my long, arduous journey of healing. And although the road was undoubtedly long and terrifyingly difficult, I vowed to myself, and to the memory of the person I once was, that I would no longer be a victim of silence. I would find my voice again. I would reclaim my strength. I would somehow, against all odds, find myself again emerging scarred but not entirely broken from the depths of this living nightmare. This story is a stark reminder of the hidden dangers that can lurk beneath the surface of seemingly normal lives. It explores the devastating consequences of silence, the insidious nature of manipulation, and the long, arduous journey of healing from unimaginable trauma. Lily's story is not just a personal tragedy. It's a cautionary tale, a plea for vigilance, for open communication, and for the courage to confront uncomfortable truths, no matter how painful they may be. If Lily's story resonated with you, if you felt even a fraction of her pain and her struggle, please let me know in the comments below. Your thoughts and reactions are important. And if you want to see what happens next in Lily's journey, if you want to witness her fight for healing and resilience in part 2, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support and engagement will help me continue sharing stories like Lily's, stories that need to be heard, stories that can spark conversations and hopefully help others who may be facing their own silent battles. Don't forget to leave a comment. What resonated with you most in Lily's story? What questions do you have? What do you hope will happen next? Let's continue this conversation. Your voice matters. Stay tuned for part 2.